Hi, I'm Dr. J. Varma, and welcome to Thermometer. On this channel, I check the temperature of health in the US and around the world and give you expert insights on infectious diseases and public health. This is our weekly episode of Inside Outbreaks. And on these episodes, I review the latest outbreaks of infectious diseases, the outbreaks that you need to know about. And I do this with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jon Epstein, veterinarian, virologist, and disease ecologist who, like me, has spent his career tracking dangerous infectious diseases across all corners of the earth. Thanks, Jon, for joining me today.
Jay, my pleasure. How are you?
I'm doing well. I had a really good Thanksgiving. I have kids who are all now in their 20s, and they were actually back here over Thanksgiving. And so, yeah, we had a really good week together. And we actually, even though we're a very active family, we did something that we haven't actually ever done before. We did one of those like turkey trots where, we go on a family
Oh,
run
nice.
on
Yeah.
Thursday morning. So
That's cool. Where did you go running in the city?
we live in Brooklyn, so we were running in Prospect Park, and interestingly enough, when we first signed up, we assumed it was a 5K because it said like five something, but it turns out to be a 5 mile run, so it was a little more intense than the average turkey trot. But yeah, we had a good time. It was a
Kids
beautiful
always
day.
check your units. Yes.
Yes,
Miles, not kilometers. But that's great. Good for you, man. It's a good
yeah, it
way
was
to
good. And
to
was
work
there
off the meal.
It's a good well, you do it before the meal, but it's a good way to feel like you've earned like a massive
Yeah.
feast afterwards and everything. And how about yourself? Did you do anything fun?
Also good, yeah. Just feeling like I'm climbing out of the weekend stupor, but it was really nice. We hosted, so we have a large extended family that came over, and I usually cook. And I love it's my favorite holiday of the year. I love Thanksgiving.
Same
It's
here. Yeah.
one of those that's about gratitude, which is great, and also some of my favorite foods. And it's like a license to just eat and enjoy and watch football, which I did a lot of this weekend. So I really enjoyed that too. I don't often get
Yeah.
to just sit down and watch games live, but it was a particularly fun weekend for that.
Yeah, it's absolutely my favorite holiday as well too. It's food, it's family, it's guests. And
Mhm.
as you mentioned, it's about gratitude, which I think is probably one of the most important sort of things that we need to keep in mind on a daily basis. And then on this show in particular, where we talk a lot about dangerous things, a lot about threats, we do a lot of
Yeah.
doom worthy predictions. It's also good to be grateful for the things we do have.
Yeah, and one of the things that you hear a lot, or at least in my family, that gets mentioned a lot when people we often go around the table and talk about things we're grateful for. Health comes up a lot. And I think that it's nice, again, you're right. We focus on some, kind of disease and lack of health issues, but people really are grateful when they're healthy. And it's a good thing to remember is that we should do what we can to always stay in a healthy state. And it requires work and effort, but it's really worthwhile. And I think life's, much more enjoyable when you can do everything you can do.
Exactly. And that's really what we're trying to do on this podcast is to give people information to empower you so that you, family, friends, colleagues can all, keep yourselves healthy and safe.
Yeah.
And on the topic of food and health, let's start with our first outbreak. And this is an update on the
Okay.
outbreak of infant botulism. So as we've discussed before, there has been a large nationwide recall of infant formula because babies who were drinking this formula were developing a severe form of paralysis caused by the bacteria Clostridium botulinum.
Mm.
And so far, there have been at least 37 now confirmed or suspected cases of infant botulism linked to a brand of infant formula called By Heart Whole Nutrition Infant Formula. And it's been recorded across 17 states. Now, what I wanted to bring up this week, and the reason I wanted to highlight it is that California public health officials who have really been at the forefront of this outbreak investigation, everything from the epidemiologic investigation to the laboratory confirmation to the public awareness activities, they've actually confirmed that there were 6 additional infant botulism cases that were detected as far back as a year ago, November
Mm.
2024, and extending all the way through June 2025, involving babies who consumed formula. So it does appear that for at least 9 months before this outbreak was recognized, this has been ongoing. And I
Mhm.
think it's a really important reminder about why we have infectious disease surveillance systems where doctors order laboratory tests, laboratories and doctors report those results to public health agencies, and public health agencies analyze them because this is an outbreak that basically was missed. It could have been picked up earlier.
Yeah. And especially when it's some kind of manufactured food product, the potential for wide scale distribution is really there. And so the surveillance becomes that much more important because these aren't, just sort of localized, a few people went to a picnic and all got sick from eating the same thing. These are foods that are produced, get contaminated, and then are distributed widely. And so the potential for cases to occur, whether it's throughout a state or even multi state outbreaks, they need to be recognized and those dots need to be connected so that it could be traced back and then more cases can be prevented.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, I mean, it's just important to highlight really briefly, like there is no absolute definition of what an outbreak is, right? We have sort of an
Mm.
epidemiologic standard where we say the number of cases is greater than expected
Right.
for a given period of time in a different given place or in a specific population. Now, what we also want to add to that often when we're talking about infectious diseases is that there was a common source. And I think one of the challenges is, let's say if you're an epidemiologist and you get a report that a baby developed botulism and you ask them about your food, there's no way to know that the formula they ate is necessarily risky unless you have reports from other families also
Right.
reporting the exact same type of formula. And sometimes families may use multiple different types of formula. Maybe they don't recall the type that they brought. And so it can take a while for there to be cases above a baseline where you suddenly are like, wait, there actually is something linking all these people together.
That's right. That's right. And it takes somebody looking at all the data together to make those connections sometimes.
Yes, exactly. And this is why we, will keep giving a similar message that we all do, why we invest in public health agencies and staffing. This isn't what you get in your hospital. Your hospital, your doctors, your nurse practitioners, whoever it is taking care of you, they're focused on your health. The reason we develop and pay for public health agencies is somebody is watching out for everybody's health and trying to draw connections between all the different people who may be sick or having some type of specific infection at any given time.
Yep.
All right, so John, so the next thing we're going to talk about is, as we have discussed many times and other people know, we're now entering the heart of flu season.
Hmm.
And we've highlighted before some of the dangers of influenza. We have this pandemic bird flu strain, H5N1, or potential pandemic strain that we're worried about, H5N1. We've been worried about the emergence of variants of H3N2, which is the seasonal influenza virus that have been causing surges in Asia and in Europe. Now we have the reports about a different strain of influenza. This is influenza A, H1N2, a variant virus that's been reported in Vermont. And so, John, this is an interesting infection because it's believed that this is not bird flu.
Right.
It's not seasonal influenza, but it was potentially transmitted by an animal. So, what do we know about this?
So this is a virus type that they're connecting to pigs, and they think this is a swine flu variant. And so it's really interesting. The pandemic we had in 2009, which was H1N1, so this is H1N2, but H1N1 was also of pig origin. And so we have to remember that although migratory birds are kind of the original reservoir for nearly all of these flu viruses, pigs are also carriers of influenza viruses, and the types of flus that infect pigs are also transmissible to people in many cases. So here's an instance where we have somebody infected by what traditionally circulates among pigs in Vermont here.
Yes, exactly. And so what we know so far from the report from the Vermont Health Department is that this was a confirmed case of H1N2 variant virus infection. The patient developed symptoms and sought healthcare during the week of October 4th. They were hospitalized, but then actually just discharged literally in less than 24 hours and have fully recovered. And it wasn't until the Vermont Department of Health sent that specimen to US CDC, which thankfully was still operating its flu lab,
Yep.
shutdown.
Yeah,
Yeah, they were
they
able to
tested
type
and
it.
typed it. Hmm.
Exactly. So, John, this is another example of how you and I were worried about the impact of the shutdown. It certainly may have slowed down in identification. That's certainly possible. The fact that it was detected and identified is a sign that at least some public health systems were functioning during that period.
Yeah, and it's worth reminding people how flu surveillance works, kind of generally speaking, is that we have seasonal influenza A viruses that are circulating. You mentioned H3N2 is our typical seasonal flu. H1N1 pandemic strain is still circulating from 2009. But when something unusual gets detected, when someone is sick and that sample happens to be tested and it is a new type of flu, a novel flu type, that's when the surveillance system pings and flags go up and it gets sequenced and reported, because the surveillance system is really designed across the country to pick up novel types of flu, so that if we see a spillover event of, say, an avian influenza or a swine influenza that could potentially be very dangerous to people beyond seasonal flu, that's the time we want to notice it, when we see those first cases, and then get on it and try to prevent spread if it's going to spread.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is, again, yet another reminder of the importance of these public health surveillance systems, all these systems that are working quietly in the background to
Mm-hmm.
detect threats on the horizon and keep us safe. So John, the next outbreak that I wanted to touch on actually is a little bit near and dear to my heart, because it's actually linked to something that I investigated when I first started my career at CDC. And this is an E. coli outbreak associated with a county fair, or a state fair in this situation. So what we have is, in Arizona, at the Arizona State Fair, there have been at least 8 children who have been hospitalized with what's known as Shiga toxin producing E. coli. That's like the hemorrhagic form of E. coli infections. And they were all associated with attending the Arizona State Fair, and in particular, going to the petting zoo at that state fair. Now, the state fair ended at the end of October 2025. And so a lot of these cases were basically occurring towards the end of October and through November. And all 4 of the families that had children who are hospitalized reported that their children petted a pig at the petting zoo. Just as we were talking about pigs related to swine flu, there are pigs potentially implicated in this outbreak as well.
Yeah, and Jay, I just want to point out, most people go to state fairs to get close to animals, to see the animals there. You go to see the microbes, Jay. I just
Yes.
want to say that is not normal. All right, but I am glad in this case you went. Somebody had to look into this. But in all seriousness, state fairs are part of not just our heritage in the United States, but pretty much worldwide. These agricultural fairs are a big deal. They're a chance for farmers to showcase their stock, for people to come together around agricultural endeavors. And so it's really common for people to have contact with not just domestic animals, but sometimes wild animals too, because sometimes these petting zoos include wildlife as well. So this kind of animal contact can be a potential for disease transmission. And I think you're probably about to say this, Jay, but one of the biggest things we need to have happen at petting zoos is hand sanitation, right? Hygiene, washing hands, disinfection stations after petting, so that people aren't touching them, their faces, or eating after handling these animals, right?
Yes, no, absolutely. So when I joined CDC in 2001 as what's called an epidemic intelligence service officer, I was assigned to work in what's called foodborne and diarrheal diseases. So bacterial and causes of why people get infections. Now, one of the first outbreak I got called to was actually right after September 11th, was a large outbreak at a county fair in what's called Lorain County, Ohio. And I had to fly to Ohio to investigate this. And there was, sure enough, the same thing. E. coli 0157, this Shiga toxin producing E. coli infections associated with a county fair. And we were trying to identify often, was it a water source? Was
Mhm.
it a petting zoo source? Was it a food source? And interestingly enough, what we found that the infections were associated with people attending a dance at a big show barn at the fair
Oh,
on the
really?
last day of the fair. And what I was able to identify was by swabbing all of the surface, including the rafters of that show barn, was to be able to identify there was widespread contamination of E. coli 0157 throughout that barn.
Amazing.
So
Amazing.
what we presumed was that there were animals shown in that farm earlier in the week, that 1 or more animals were infected with E. coli 0157, excreted in their stool. It contaminated the sawdust. The floors are contaminated with sawdust.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then when people come to a dance and are dancing on sawdust, they're kicking up the dust in the air, or the sawdust in the air, and spreading it all over the building. And interestingly enough, while I was there, I got called to another county fair outbreak. I had to go to Sandusky, Ohio, to another source of an outbreak. And as a result of that, I actually worked for part of my first year at CDC on helping this national organization of county fairs develop guidelines for how to make county fairs safer, specifically because these types of outbreaks, as you point out, they serve an incredible cultural and business purpose in communities.
Yeah.
but they also have a risk.
Yeah, I have a petting agricultural fair story too, and it happened to be when I was at CDC. I had a brief stint there in the viral and rickettsial disease department many years ago, and I believe it was in Idaho. There was an ag fair, and they had petting area with different animals, and among the animals you could pet was a bear cub or a bear they had that was, I guess, tame enough to allow people to handle it and get in with it. And so, hundreds of people came through and were petting this, and then it turned out maybe 5 days later, after the fair closed, the bear was rabid. Found out that it had rabies. And then the health department, knowing this, had to go contact every single person who came into contact with that bear, just in case they had gotten saliva on their hands or, God forbid, were bitten and scratched by this bear. And so it was a huge, huge problem to trace everybody that might have been exposed to rabies from handling that bear.
Did anybody end up getting rabies as a result?
Fortunately not. I don't believe
Yeah.
there were any cases associated, but man, it was scary.
Yes, no, absolutely. And so, this is just another important reminder, and we're going to talk about that with our next topic as well about, animals are a great source. Well, obviously they're critical to our health. This is the entire purpose of your life's work, is to show how, biodiversity and plant and animal species impacts our health. But we have to be careful about all of our interactions. And it's clear that these outbreaks that I worked on in the early 2000s continue to be a potential problem. And it really comes down to, as you point out, just being very scrupulous about, if you are a parent or a child going to these things, or your parent supervising a child, very rigorous in hand hygiene and skin contact. The problem is people touch stuff. A toddler comes in with their pacifier, it drops on the ground. There are so many ways of potentially come into contact. And also, of course, potentially doing surveillance on the animals and making sure that no ill animals are in those petting areas as well.
Yeah, it's funny, we kind of take it for granted, but we're very well versed in the things that people get that make us sick. We know about kids in daycare and kids in school picking up respiratory illness, or, us going into a crowded situation. And then with animals, it's trickier because in general, our default setting is, well, animals don't really make us sick. What they have can't affect us. So let's cuddle them, let's kiss them, let's pet them, touch them, and not worry about it. And the truth is, that's mostly true, but occasionally there are things that animals can carry that, if they get into our bodies, can make us ill. And so we just need to level up our awareness about some of these situations. Petting zoos are absolutely amazing. I love them. Going to farms, getting in contact with animals is important. But let's wash our hands. Let's think about hygiene. Just keep in our minds that there are some things that can make us sick if we're not careful.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so on that note, we're going to segue into our next topic, John, which is right up your alley and right along these themes. And that is an outbreak that is not occurring in humans, but it is occurring in horses.
Yes.
And, we are a country that, broadly speaking, loves horses. I can think of lots of people in my family. I can think of other people I know who, love to ride horses if they ever get the
My
opportunity.
daughters, if they were given their druthers, would be on horseback all day long.
Well, yeah, yeah. And a lot of people really also, I've known people, I met somebody sometime in the past couple of years who used to tell me about horse therapy, like, bonding with horses as a way to help heal sort of anxiety or depression. So, John, but there is an outbreak right now, a multi-state outbreak of equine herpes virus infection in the United States. And it's been traced to the Women's Professional Rodeo Association World Finals, which was held in Waco, Texas, in early November. And as of middle of November, there have been at least 16 cases confirmed in horses across Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Colorado, and New Mexico. And so there seems to be very rapid transmission of this virus. So, John, tell me a little bit about this virus. Why is it that something we should be concerned about?
Okay. So here's a case now where we're talking about an animal pathogen that does not affect people. So this is not a zoonotic disease, but it can be a bad one in certain instances with horses. And to start with, it's a herpes virus. So not unlike our human herpes simplex virus, this is a virus that's really common in horses, almost ubiquitous. So horses carry it commonly, and just like our herpes virus or human herpes viruses, most of the time it can stay dormant. It can just sit latent in the nervous system in a horse. But under times of stress, especially if a horse is a show horse or a performance horse and it's traveling, you can have outbreaks of this virus. It can reactivate and reinfect a horse. And it's transmitted through close close contact, horses nuzzling each other. It can be transmitted through fomites, which means it could get on a handler's clothing or on their hands. And if they're touching one horse or another, it can spread that way. And so it's pretty infectious. And a lot of times it causes a respiratory disease in horses. Mostly they recover from it and then they're fine. But in this instance, when it progresses to a neurologic disease, which happens when it affects cells along the spinal cord and along the nervous system and causes a severe inflammatory response, then you start to get very severe disease that can be fatal. Horses start stumbling, they're weak, they're uncoordinated, they can have fever, they can go down. And when horses go down, that can be very serious. And so this can lead to really serious health problems and even death in horses when it gets to the neurologic stage.
Yeah. And so what is the best way to prevent this from being transmitted then? Is it just early identification, isolation, and quarantine of animals?
Well, certainly if you recognize infection in a horse, if it's clinical, you want to isolate it and make sure there's no contact with other horses. That helps prevent spread. But Jay, there actually are vaccines against equine herpes virus. And so commercially available vaccines you can give to horses. And it's important to understand that these vaccines do not totally prevent infection, but what they do is they can reduce the severity of clinical disease and they can lower viremia enough that might help reduce transmission. It doesn't completely rid them of the virus, but it can reduce signs of transmission. So one thing you can do to protect your horse, if you have a traveling horse that competes or gets shown around and is moving around a lot, is to vaccinate it. And the vaccines are twice annual shots. The immunity is fairly short-lived, so you have to boost it every 6 months, but this can be very effective at keeping your horse safe.
Well, let's hope that the people who care about these animals are not anti-vaxxers themselves, right?
Oh man, yeah,
And actually believe in vaccines, because this is just yet another example. I mean, it'd be interesting to see some of the behavior, right? There may be, I don't know for sure, there may be humans in those groups that are suspicious about the safety and effectiveness of vaccines, but when it comes to your livelihood and certainly animals that people absolutely adore and love and cherish, whether or not they will take those safety precautions. Because yeah, as you point out, when we have a vaccine that's available, particularly for something as devastating as this, it's really important to consider using it.
Absolutely, Jay.
All right. So the last topic I wanted, and this is a sort of a potpourri of animal related outbreaks that are relevant.
Veterinary episode
is a veterinary one, but I really did want to highlight this because it again is another example. We began this episode talking about food safety issues, kids eating, babies drinking contaminated infant formula and the importance of food safety. And we've extended that to talking about outbreaks in animals. And now we have something where those two things collide. So the news here is that the United Kingdom has been banning imports of pork from Spain due to an outbreak of African swine fever. And Spain, for people's background, is the European Union's top pork producer. And up until recently, it's avoided any major outbreaks of this virus called African swine fever. But there have been some animals detected in Catalonia, a region central to pig farming, who have African swine fever. So, John, tell me a little bit about this, because it really impacts, the economic productivity of an important pig producing country, but also has implications for the food supply across all of Europe, and then potentially, of course, the United States as well.
Yeah, absolutely. This squarely falls into a category of a truly horrendous disease, both for the pigs that get it and economically for the countries that have to deal with this. African swine fever is a very, very contagious DNA virus that is carried by domestic pigs and also wild boar. And the fact that wild pigs can carry it means it can move freely from farm to farm in areas where it's endemic or enzootic, where the animals are carrying it. Again, this is not a zoonosis, so this doesn't make people sick, but when it gets into a farm, it's so contagious and it can cause acute death in pigs. It can cause very severe illness with high fever, anorexia, where they stop eating, lethargy. Some pigs will bleed and they can suddenly die. And when it gets into your pig herd, the only way to control this is really to depopulate the farm, sterilize the environment, and start over. So you can imagine why this is so economically devastating. And for countries where African swine fever is present, they have trade restrictions. They're not allowed to export because there are other parts parts of the world that don't have African swine fever. And currently, this is something that is circulating throughout Africa, but also throughout Asia and parts of Europe. And as you mentioned, Spain being one of those places. Here in the Americas, we're mostly free of African swine fever. But, Jay, there is a bit of concern because it does pop up occasionally in the Caribbean, in some of the islands there. And so this is something we desperately don't want to get onto continental North America or South America for sure.
What is the main source by which it's spread? Is it basically you have to be, it's restricted to pigs or boars, and so it has to be spread by a contaminated boar? Or are there other ways in which it can be transmitted?
Well, there's a couple ways. From pig to pig, it's generally close contact, so droplet spread, but it can also be spread through pork products and meat that are contaminated with virus, particularly raw or undercooked pork. And this is a virus that survives in the environment very well. So a lot of times viruses don't last very long on surfaces because things like sunlight or drying out can kill them. But this is a case of a virus that's pretty hardy, Jay, so it can last for weeks or even months on inanimate objects. And so it's possible to spread via farm equipment, on people's clothing, or just through the movement of pork products from infected animals.
Yeah, and we spend most of our time here talking about human health, infections, and about talking about the importance of protecting our building these systems to detect and control infectious diseases among humans. But I just started to think for myself, okay, so the three of the major sources of protein that Americans eat are poultry. They're now at risk because of H5N1, bird flu virus. Beef, we've highlighted before, the risk of the screwworm infections that have been spreading throughout Central and Latin America and as close as Mexico. And now we think about pigs and pork products at a risk of African swine fever. So our defenses against infectious diseases aren't really just about human protection, but they're about protecting our food supply.
Absolutely.
Because it looks like three of the major sources of protein, there's emerging and highly transmissible infections, devastating infections being spread very close and integrated to the United States.
It's so important to emphasize. And I forgot to mention one other way that it spreads, Jay, and that is in some places it's tick-borne as well. So soft-body ticks can spread this. But to your point, it's kind of a double whammy because not only can it be devastating for the health of livestock, and so it causes, death in pigs and then depopulation as a control measure, but economically it's devastating. So people not only have, compromised food supply, but also there are huge economic losses for a country, which has all kinds of knock-on effects. And as the world's human population grows, exponentially, we are increasing our demand for protein. And so we're seeing an intensification of farming, whether it's poultry or pigs or beef. And aside from the environmental toll, there's real vulnerabilities in terms of infectious disease. And so it makes biosecurity that much more important. And it also makes us ask the question whether there are better alternatives to protein sources, plant-based proteins that could take some of the pressure off some of this intensified livestock production that we're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think the other piece of that too is also, in addition to reducing sort of a consumption of animal proteins like this, about what the role is also of restricting our use to things that are more locally produced, right? So you don't have this massive agriculture, industrial farming. Now, I'm not saying I've done that in my own life. Our family eats plenty of meat and things like that, but it's one of those situations. And we think probably the best thing for all of us would be if we were eating more locally produced products, which would reduce some of the economic demand for this mass production of food, which results in the transmission of these infectious diseases.
So Jay, I couldn't agree with you more. This is actually something I have done in my life. And, I recognize that it's privileged to be living near farming communities. But one thing that I do is when I'm buying meats, like for example, at Thanksgiving, I went to a local farm and bought a turkey from that local farm. Whenever I'm eating any kind of beef or chicken products, I go to farmer's market and I know it's coming from a farm in upstate. So I really am trying to make an effort to buy locally raised animals as one, for one big reason is to hedge against some of these mass produced, intensified processes, but also to just be very conscious of where it's coming from. Too.
Yeah. And I think that's really, really an important point here. I think a lot of people get upset when any of us make statements like, oh, we need to reduce our animal protein intake because they think we're regulating what they do. Well, another way to do that is not necessarily to reduce your intake, but just to be more particular about where you choose from. And I think it's hard, regardless of what your political opinions are, it's hard to object to the idea of like, I want to support the people in my community who raise these animals. I mean, that should be something that has zero political statement. That should be purely something that we just all want to do because it's good for our community to help the people in that community. And so,
I agree.
yeah, so I think that is another appropriate approach. This is not just to reduce your overall consumption of protein. If you want to keep, eating the same amount of beef, chicken and beef, is to try to prioritize, if you can, buying from local producers. Support your local farmers. Yeah. All right, John. And on that note, we're going to close this week's episode. If you're watching this episode, listening to it, you like what you're hearing, you enjoy watching us, you enjoy hearing about infectious diseases and public health, please hit the like button. Please subscribe. Please comment. Give us suggestions for things you want to talk about. It really helps us spread the word, and really does ultimately help protect public health.
Yeah. And thank you to those who have subscribed. I run into people who watch the show, like the show, Jay, and it's great to get that feedback. And if there are any questions, any requests, any interest in certain topics, please do let us know via the comments under the show.
Okay. And on that note, we'll be back next week with another episode of Inside Outbreaks.
All right. Be well.